I walked into the hearing room on a Tuesday morning in November carrying nothing but a manila folder and whatever composure I had left after 5 years of deliberate silence. The fluorescent lights in the Caldwell County Administrative Building hummed at a frequency that seemed designed to irritate. I set my folder on the respondent's table, smoothed the front of my jacket, and sat down. At the table across the room, my parents sat beside their attorney, a compact, self-assured man named Gerald Fitch who had the look of someone accustomed to winning arguments before they started. My mother didn't look at me. My father looked at me the way you look at a stranger who is sitting in your usual seat at a restaurant. I had not spoken to either of them in close to 5 years. The last real conversation ended with my father saying I had wasted every opportunity they had given me, and my mother nodding along like she was co-signing a loan. I packed 2 duffel bags that night and drove south before dawn. No dramatic goodbye. No forwarding address. Just the particular peace that comes when you finally stop waiting for people to understand you. I had not planned to return to Caldwell County at all. Then my grandmother died. Her name was Loretta. She was my father's mother, a small, deliberate woman who had spent 78 years in the same county and had somehow managed in all that time to be honest without being cruel. She used to say that most people confuse loudness with strength. She was never loud. She called me every few weeks during the years I was away. She never asked me to come home. She only ever asked whether I was taking care of myself. The call came from her physician, a Dr. Haynes, who had been treating her for the past 2 years. He told me she had passed quietly, and that her attorney had reached out because her will contained specific instructions for me. I sat in my apartment in Raleigh for a long time after that call, staring at the wall above my desk. The space in my chest that opened up when he said her name felt less like grief and more like a floor giving way. Her will left me the house she owned on Sutter Road, a modest 2-story with a vegetable garden along the south fence and a screened porch where she kept her reading chair. It was not a large property. It was not worth what my parents thought it was worth. But it was the only place in Caldwell County where I had ever felt like myself, and I suspect Loretta knew that. My parents found out within 48 hours. My father called from a number I recognized and left a voicemail that lasted 4 minutes. The essential message was that the house should come to them, that I had no right to property in a family I had abandoned, and that Loretta must have been confused in her final months. I did not call back. 3 weeks later, I was served with a formal dispute filing at my apartment door. I drove to Caldwell County on a gray Sunday and let myself into Loretta's house with the key she had mailed me 2 years earlier, tucked inside a birthday card with no explanation. The house smelled like cedar and old paper. Her reading glasses were still on the table beside the porch chair. I sat down in that chair, looked out at the dormant garden, and spent a long time thinking about what I was walking into. The first time I saw Gerald Fitch in person was 2 days before the hearing when he approached me outside the county records office. He was polite in the calibrated way attorneys are polite when they want to appear reasonable before making an unreasonable request. He told me my parents were under considerable financial pressure. He told me that Loretta's house represented meaningful stability for them at this stage of life. Then he told me that if I signed the property over voluntarily, we could avoid an unpleasant public proceeding. I told him I would see him at the hearing. He smiled with his mouth only. The hearing room held perhaps 30 people, most of them Caldwell County residents with no legal stake in the matter. Small county proceedings have always drawn a crowd. The adjudicator was a woman named Patricia Voss, 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back, the expression of someone who had presided over too many family disputes to be surprised by any of them. Fitch went first. He built his argument carefully, the way a person builds something they expect to last. My parents had maintained close ties with Loretta. They had assisted with her medical appointments, her grocery runs, her home repairs. I, by contrast, had been absent for years. I had not attended family holidays. I had not visited during Loretta's illness. The picture he painted was of a woman who returned only when there was something to collect. Then my mother asked to speak. She stood with the practiced posture of someone who had rehearsed. She told adjudicator Voss about the years of worry, the holidays with an empty chair, the phone calls that went unreturned. She was not wrong about any of it. But then her voice shifted into something harder, something she had been carrying for a long time, and had finally found a room large enough to release it into. She looked at me directly and said that I had always been the selfish one. That I had taken from this family my whole life and given nothing back. That I was, in the end, simply a disappointment she had stopped expecting anything from. The room went quiet in that specific way it does when someone has said something that cannot be unsaid. Adjudicator Voss did not react immediately. She made a note. Then she looked at my folder on the table in front of me. Before she could speak, Fitch moved to continue his argument. Voss raised one hand slightly and stopped him. She looked at the folder again, then at me with the measuring expression of someone recalibrating. She said quietly, "Miss Hale, perhaps you'd like to submit your documentation." I brought my folder to the clerk. Inside were the letters I had written to Loretta over 5 years, most of them returned with her handwriting in the margins. There were records of the money transfers I had sent her quarterly. Nothing large but consistent, enough to cover the property tax 2 years running when she mentioned it casually in a phone call. There was also a letter from my former employer, the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, where I had worked for 6 years as a regional compliance analyst overseeing audit documentation for 3 states. Fitch looked at the letterhead for a long moment. Voss read through the documents with the focused quiet of someone who reads carefully for a living. She paused at the VA letter. She set it down. She looked at Fitch. "Counselor," she said. "Are you familiar with your opposing party's professional background?" Fitch said he understood her to be a private citizen with no particular standing. "She spent 6 years conducting federal compliance audits," Voss said. "She has documented every financial contribution she made to this estate. She has corresponding written records from the decedent, acknowledging receipt." She set her pen down. "The picture you presented this morning appears to be missing several relevant details." My father leaned forward. My mother turned to look at me as though she were seeing a different person sitting at the table. Fitch recovered as well as he could. He argued that professional credentials did not determine inheritance rights. Voss agreed with him. She also noted, without particular emphasis, that they did tend to complicate arguments about a person's character and intentions. She said it the way someone says a true thing that doesn't require elaboration. My mother said sharply that she hadn't known any of this. That I had never told them. I looked at her steadily. "You never asked," I said. Voss upheld the will. The house on Sutter Road remained mine. When the room cleared, my parents stayed seated. Their attorney left quickly. I gathered my folder and stood, and for a moment, the 3 of us occupied that room without the structure of legal proceedings to organize the silence. My father spoke first. His voice had lost its courtroom certainty. He asked what I had actually been doing, all those years. I told him. Not everything, but enough. The compliance work, the travel, the slow accumulation of a life that had nothing to do with Caldwell County. He listened in the way people listen when they are revising something they thought they already understood. My mother said she had assumed the worst because I had given her no information, and I told her as gently as I could that I had stopped offering information because it was never received the way I intended it. That the conversation always became an argument. That eventually I chose silence over repetition. She didn't respond immediately. Then she said that calling me a disappointment had been wrong. She said it plainly without performance. My father nodded beside her. I did not tell them it was fine. It wasn't fine. But I told them it was noted, and that I was going to fix up the house, and that if they wanted to see what Loretta had left behind, they were welcome to come by. The following weekend, my father arrived with a toolbox. We repaired the south fence without speaking much. The silence was different from the silence in the hearing room. It was the kind that comes before something rather than after. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that settles over you when a conflict you have been carrying for years finally reaches its conclusion. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like setting down something heavy and noticing for the first time how much your arms ache. Loretta used to say that families are not made from biology alone. They are made from the slow work of showing up, even when showing up is inconvenient. I don't know yet whether my parents and I will manage that work. But I know that for the first time in years, the door is no longer locked from either side. If there is someone in your life you have been certain you understood completely, a child, a parent, a sibling you haven't spoken to in years, I want to ask you something. When did you last ask them a question you didn't already have an answer for? The morning they left, my mother checked her carry-on twice, verified her passport, and reminded my father to confirm the Uber. She did not check on me. I was 11 years old, standing at the top of the stairs in socked feet, watching them move through the front hallway with the brisk efficiency of people running late for something important. My mother, Sylvia, wore a cream linen blazer and had her hair pinned up the way she only did when she wanted to be photographed. My father, Owen, said almost nothing, which was not unusual. He existed in our house the way furniture exists, present, functional, easy to overlook. Before she walked out, my mother set two things on the kitchen table: a folded pair of $10 bills and a silver credit card still sealed in a small paper sleeve. $20 for the month, she said. The card is for emergencies only. Don't be reckless with it. Then she wheeled her suitcase through the door, and my father followed, and the lock clicked behind them. I stood at the window and watched the rideshare pull away from the curb. I waited 5 minutes, the way you wait after a noise in the dark, to be certain. They didn't come back. We lived in a beige colonial on a cul-de-sac in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. The lawn was edged every 2 weeks by a service my mother paid for but liked to imply she managed herself. She had nearly 9,000 followers on a lifestyle account where she posted Sunday dinners, seasonal table settings, and photos with captions like "so grateful for this little life." If you scrolled far enough back, you'd find photos of me toddler age useful for the aesthetic. By the time I was 8 or 9, I'd been quietly edited out. She said I didn't like being photographed. I'd learned not to argue with her narration of my own preferences. My father worked long hours in municipal contracting. He came home tired, ate what was on the table, and treated silence like a courtesy he was extending to everyone. He wasn't unkind. He was simply absent in a way that had nothing to do with geography. I'd been making my own breakfast since 2nd grade. I signed my own field trip forms. I was, as my mother liked to tell company, remarkably self-sufficient for her age. She said it with the mild pride of someone describing a low-maintenance houseplant. I thought this was ordinary. I thought every child learned early to take up as little space as possible, to be grateful for attention rather than expect it. I did not yet understand that I was being prepared very efficiently to be left. 2 weeks before their departure, my mother called me to the living room and told me about Europe the way someone announces a schedule change: Paris, then Rome, then a Greek island whose name she mispronounced. 1 month. You're old enough to manage, she said. You've been doing it half your life already. My father stood by the sliding door to the backyard, his back to both of us. I asked who would stay with me. She looked at me the way she looked at autocorrect errors, brief irritation quickly suppressed. No one, she said. You know how to take care of yourself. That's the whole point. The credit card, I would discover 3 days into their absence, had never been activated. I found this out standing at a gas station register with a bottle of juice and a can of soup, listening to the cashier's flat voice. I put the juice back. I kept the soup. $20. 30 days. I did the arithmetic walking home. 66 cents per day, rounded up. I went to the grocery store and stood in the dry goods aisle with the calculator app open, moving my lips. 6 packs of instant ramen. A loaf of white bread. A jar of peanut butter. I carried the bag home in both arms and rationed with a seriousness that, looking back, should have broken my own heart. Half a pack of noodles in the morning. Half at night. I drank water between meals so my stomach had something to process. On day 5 I called her. I could hear music behind her voice, something European and ambient. Mom, the card doesn't work. I don't have money for food. She exhaled slowly, the particular exhale that always preceded a sigh. You're being dramatic, Vera. $20 is plenty if you're not wasteful. She hung up. That night I opened her social account. New post. My mother at a candlelit restaurant. A small plate of something intricate in front of her, laughing at something off camera. La Dolce Vita, the caption read. I got the old tablet from my desk drawer, opened the camera and pressed record. Today is day 5, I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. Mom posted from a 3-star restaurant. I ate half a pack of ramen. I kept going. My neighbor, Mr. Desmond Fife, was 72 and had lived in the yellow house beside ours since before my parents bought theirs. He walked with a slight limp and kept a cat named something I could never quite catch. He noticed the empty driveway on day 7, knocked on my door with the careful knock of someone who already suspects the answer. I wanted to say everything was fine. I was pale and my lips were dry and I hadn't slept well in a week. And he was looking at me with the patient attention of someone who had seen things before. Would you like to come over for dinner? He said. I made too much. We both understood he had not. I ate spaghetti at his kitchen table that night, and told him the truth because I was too depleted to construct a lie. He listened without interrupting. Afterward, he sat back and said quietly, I won't call anyone yet. But I'm going to bring you something every day, and you should keep writing things down. A record. Everything. Dates and details. He paused. Evidence is the thing that gets believed. Summer enrichment had started the 2nd week. My mother had enrolled me months earlier, not I knew because she valued the coursework, but because a child in a structured program. By day 3 I nearly collapsed during a math exercise. I woke up on the cot in the nurse's office with a woman I didn't know looking at my face. She put me on a scale. She asked when I'd last eaten. She asked where my parents were. Miss Aldridge, my teacher, was present when the nurse and I spoke. Neither of them said the words I was afraid of, but they exchanged a look I recognized as one adults use when they've decided something. I see you, Miss Aldridge said, simply, after everyone else had stepped out. That's all. I just want you to know that. I hadn't cried in 2 weeks. I did not cry then either. But something in my chest loosened slightly, like a knot that had been pulled too tight. My mother called that evening. I heard the school contacted someone. What exactly did you say? I told her I hadn't said anything. You're embarrassing this family, she said, voice dropping to the register she used when she wanted to be taken seriously. If you breathe one word to anyone, a teacher, a neighbor, anyone, I will put you in boarding school when I get home. You will not be living here. Do you understand me? I said yes. I hung up. My hands were shaking. I opened the tablet and pressed record. I said what had just happened. I said it plainly, without performance, the way you state facts you need to remember. I documented 22 consecutive days. Footage of the refrigerator. Footage of the bathroom scale. Receipts from the grocery store. Dated journal entries. I read her threatening voicemail transcription into the camera word by word. Miss Yun, the caseworker assigned after the school filed a report, arrived on day 22. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, opened the refrigerator, looked at the trash, turned to me. Do you have anything you'd like to show me? I brought her the tablet. She watched without speaking. When the last video ended, she said, You're very careful, Vera. This matters. Then she asked the question no adult had asked me directly before. Do you want to be safe? I said yes. Out loud for the first time. The legal picture that assembled itself over the following days was detailed and unambiguous. 22 videos. A school medical report documenting 9 pounds of weight loss in 2 weeks. Financial records obtained by subpoena. My parents had spent just under $44,000 in 30 days. The credit card left for me had been requested but never activated. This was not oversight. The account notes confirmed the card had been flagged and set aside before their departure. My mother had planned a welcome home party for 38 guests. There was a catered spread, a slide projection of their trip photos, and a banner above the front window. She was mid-conversation, holding a glass of something sparkling, when the doorbell rang. She opened it with the smile already arranged on her face. Miss Yoon stood on the porch with 2 officers behind her. Someone in the living room said, "Oh, 1 syllable, nothing else." The music kept playing for a moment before someone cut it. My mother started to close the door. The officer explained quietly that they had a warrant. The slide projector, still running, clicked to a new image. Then someone had connected a laptop, and the screen changed. My face, pale, 11 years old, holding the tablet at arm's length. "Today is day 15, my voice said from the speaker. "There is 1 egg in the refrigerator. I have $4 left." My mother posted from a rooftop restaurant. The room was completely still. My mother turned to her guests. She said it was a misunderstanding. She said I was imaginative. She said I had a history of exaggerating. Miss Yun opened a folder and read from it without inflection. No caregiver had checked on the property in 30 days. The supplementary card had been deliberately left inactive. She had spent $44,000. No one in the room spoke. No one moved to offer my mother a defense. The officers walked both my parents out. My mother paused at the door and looked back at the banner. She and my father accepted a plea agreement. Probation, community service hours, a felony record. The family court judge terminated their parental rights at the same hearing, reading from her decision in a voice that had no particular drama in it. My mother's sister Nora had already submitted guardianship paperwork. The court approved it that morning. Aunt Nora lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with mismatched dishes and a second-hand couch with a throw blanket draped over the worn arm. It was the most comfortable place I had ever lived. She came to my school events and wrote them on the kitchen calendar in red pen. She sat across from me at dinner and asked follow-up questions. I kept waiting for her patience to expire. It didn't. I'm 18 now. I start college in the fall, a full merit scholarship, pre-law. I found 2 letters in my desk last week, both from my mother, forwarded through the court system. She said she was in therapy. She said she understood what she had done. She said she was proud of me, and then, to her credit, acknowledged she had no standing to be. I read both letters in full. I put them back in their envelopes. I haven't written back. I'm not sure whether I will. But the decision is mine, which is something that took me years to understand I was allowed to have. She left me with $20 and a card she knew wouldn't work. She calculated that love and obedience would be enough to keep me quiet. She was wrong about all of it. Have you ever been told in 100 small ways that your silence was the price of belonging, that speaking up would cost you more than suffering quietly? I'd like to ask you what you did with that. Because some of us learned, slowly and at considerable cost, that silence only ever protects the people it benefits. Not you? Never you. The sound that registered first wasn't the estate attorney's voice reading figures aloud. It was my aunt's laughter, a bright, rehearsed sound, as she received confirmation that the bulk of my grandmother Nora's estate, nearly $4 million in liquid assets and property holdings, was going to her. Then the attorney slid a single sheet toward me. A symbolic bequest, $1,000, and a sealed envelope marked with my name in my grandmother's handwriting. My uncle didn't bother pretending to look apologetic. "You've always been resourceful, Delia," he said. "You'll land somewhere." My aunt touched her pearl earring and smiled at her daughter, Prue, who was seated beside her and said nothing, even though we had grown up sleeping in rooms across the hall from each other. I kept both hands flat on the conference table and didn't speak. Have you ever sat in a room where your erasure was being administered professionally with a notary present? I grew up in a family where belonging was conditional, and the conditions were never written down. My grandmother, Constance, had raised me alongside my cousins after my parents died in a car accident when I was 6. She was capable and unsentimental, but she saw me, not always warmly, not always fairly, but she saw me. Her daughter, my Aunt Renata, ran the household social calendar. Her son-in-law, my Uncle Philip, handled the family's financial affairs. I was the one who filled the gaps, scheduling contractors, managing Constance's medical paperwork, tracking insurance appeals, coordinating the accountant's quarterly visits. Delia's thorough, Renata would say to guests, the same tone she'd use to describe a reliable appliance. I worked in healthcare compliance. I spent my days auditing billing records, identifying irregularities in documentation, tracing patterns across financial cycles. The work required patience and an ability to see what numbers obscured rather than what they revealed. Philip knew what I did for a living. He never once asked me about it. Constance had taught me to be quiet and observant. She kept a small garden behind the house, and on weekend mornings when I was young, she would take me outside before anyone else was awake. She'd crouch by the beds, pulling weeds with deliberate fingers. "You notice things, Delia," she told me once without looking up. "Don't let anyone talk you out of that." She never explained what she meant. She didn't need to. I understood my place by the time I was 12. Prue was the daughter of the house, celebrated, amplified, forwarded. I was the one who made things run. At Prue's 16th birthday, I spent the afternoon setting up folding tables and ferrying platters from the kitchen. I overheard her tell a neighbor, "Delia doesn't need the same things Prue does. She's always been self-contained." I carried 2 more platters and said nothing. That sentence became a fixture in me, something I returned to without meaning to. In their version of the family, not needing things meant not deserving them. I understood that, eventually I would have to decide whether to keep proving them right. The morning after the estate reading, I left the attorney's office before Renata could suggest we all have lunch. I drove to the small inn on the eastern edge of town where I'd stayed once before, years ago, during a work trip. The owner remembered me. She handed me a key and didn't ask questions. In the room, I opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Constance, a smaller folded note, and a short sequence of numbers. The letter was sparse. It said, "I have watched this family arrange the truth to suit themselves for a long time. You were the only one who never asked me to." Below the numbers, she had written one line, "The filing cabinet in the study. The brown key on the ring." I read the letter 4 times. Then I opened my laptop. What followed was not emotional. It was methodical. I pulled the records Philip had filed on Constance's behalf over the previous 8 years. I knew where to look because I had helped organize them. I cross-referenced them against the public filings for the small family holding company he managed. I flagged the irregularities in yellow. Then I flagged the patterns in red. Rounded transfers. Advisory fees billed to accounts Constance had never authorized in writing. A series of documentation gaps that individually could be explained away. Together they formed a shape I recognized immediately from my professional work. Someone had been redirecting assets for years, carefully, in amounts that would not trigger automatic review. I drove to Constance's house after dark. Renata and Philip's cars were in the driveway. I let myself in through the side entrance. They were in the sitting room. I heard Philip's voice carrying down the hallway. He was already discussing which accounts to consolidate. I moved quietly through the corridor to Constance's study. The filing cabinet opened on the first try. Inside were folders organized by year, printed emails, handwritten annotations, and a small digital recorder. A second envelope, sealed, addressed to me. Constance had built a record. Not out of fury, out of precision. She had watched, and she had documented, and she had waited for the right person to find it. I scanned what I needed, uploaded copies to 2 separate secure drives, and left before anyone passed the hallway. I heard Renata say my name as I reached the side door, not to me, just about me, dismissive and certain. I stepped out into the cold air and drove back to the inn. I worked until 2 in the morning, building a clean timeline, dates, figures, signatures, gaps. The meeting Constance had arranged through her attorney took place 3 days later in the same conference room. I had not told Renata or Philip it was happening. They arrived expecting a formality. Constance's attorney, a quiet woman named Miss Verga, was already seated. She placed a folder on the table and a small audio device beside it. She pressed play. Constance's voice came through the speaker, steady and unhurried, as if she were in the next room. She spoke for 4 minutes. She described what she had found, what she had documented, and why she had chosen to structure the estate as she had. She named specific transactions. She referenced specific dates. Renata's posture changed within the first 30 seconds. Philip's jaw tightened. When the recording ended, Ms. Varga opened the folder. The estate's secondary clause was clear. If the initial distribution were contested, the full remainder would transfer to a charitable medical foundation Constance had designated. The clause regarding potential legal review of advisory conduct was described in 3 careful sentences. Philip's face went still. I set the key from the filing cabinet on the table. A small, quiet sound. Renata looked at it as though it had said something she wasn't prepared to answer. "There's nothing left to clarify, Miss Varga said. I didn't speak. There was nothing I needed to add. Prue, seated at the end of the table, stared at her hands. She did not look at me. I noticed, without feeling much about it, that she hadn't looked at me once since the first meeting either. My uncle started to object. Renata placed her hand on his arm, once briefly. He stopped. They both understood that the room had already moved past them. I signed the acknowledgement documents, shook Miss Varga's hand and left. I stayed in town for another week, handling the transfer paperwork and meeting with the foundation's incoming director. I leased a small apartment on the other side of the city. 2 rooms with east-facing windows, quiet in the mornings, nothing that needed anything from me except the rent. I visited a therapist twice that month, not because I was falling apart but because I wanted to understand what I was actually feeling, which was less triumphant than I'd imagined and more like the particular silence that follows a long noise. She asked me if I was grieving. I sat with that for a moment. I said not them, exactly. The version of them I kept hoping would eventually appear. She nodded and wrote something down. The grief, if that's what it was for a door that had never actually been open. I had just taken years to stop knocking. There is no satisfaction in that kind of clarity, only the steadiness that comes after you stop arguing with what was always true. Renata sent one message, 3 weeks later. It was brief and suggested that things had been misunderstood and that family should come. I read it once. I didn't respond. Not out of anger. There was very little of that left. But because she had already answered every question I might have asked about what she meant by family. I keep Constance's letter in the left drawer of my desk. I don't read it often. I don't need to. It says what it says. I see you. I always did. That is the only inheritance that will never need a notary. Some people will tell you that family loyalty means absorbing whatever is asked of you without naming the cost. Others will say that walking away proves you never really loved them. Both arguments assume that staying silent and staying whole are the same thing. So I'll leave you with this. If someone in your life has been quietly maintaining the foundation everyone else stands on, is the thanks they receive worth what it cost them to keep showing up? The morning they walked into my courtroom, I had already read the case file 3 times. I don't think they recognized me at first. Why would they? The last time Vera and Clyde Holcomb had laid eyes on me, I was 17 years old, standing in the driveway of their house in Decatur. That was 22 years ago. The woman at the bench now wore a robe and a practiced stillness they hadn't been there to watch me build. So no, they didn't recognize me. They sat in the gallery with the kind of smug, composed certainty that people wear when they believe the outcome is already decided. They were wrong about that too, just like they had been wrong about everything else. But the moment that cracked the morning open, the moment the room inhaled and held its breath, came when their attorney walked through the side door. His name was Gerald Fitch, a downtown litigator with the kind of silver hair that costs money to maintain. He moved across the courtroom with the fluency of a man accustomed to winning. He passed the gallery. He passed his own clients. He stopped directly in front of the bench, set his briefcase down, and said 4 words in a voice that carried to every corner of that room. "Good morning, Your Honor." I watched Vera's face go the color of old plaster. Clyde's hand gripped the back of the pew ahead of him. And for one suspended second, the whole room existed only for them to understand what they had never once considered. The daughter they threw away had become the judge they needed to impress. People tend to imagine a life like mine must have had a clean beginning somewhere. They assume there must have been a loving household, a stable adolescence, A set of parents who cheered at school plays and asked about homework. They build that story in their minds because the alternative is too uncomfortable to sit with. The alternative is, some children are discarded. Some children are sent into the cold because they became inconvenient. I was the inconvenient one. Pregnant at 17, the result of a relationship my parents had forbidden, and a night I spent 2 years blaming myself. When I told them, Vera didn't cry. She didn't reach for me or ask if I was okay. She asked who else knew. Clyde stood by the kitchen window with his arms crossed, looking at the middle distance the way men do when they've already decided something. You can't stay here, Vera finally said. You've made your choice. They gave me until morning. I left before dawn with what I could carry. The only person I called was my great-aunt Rosalind, my grandmother's younger sister who lived 40 minutes outside the city in a house that smelled permanently of cedar and black tea. I had no reason to expect her to answer. It was 4 a.m. She answered on the second ring. Come, she said. Just come. Rosalind was 71 at the time, a retired postal worker. A widow, a woman who had raised 3 children on her own and buried one of them and kept living anyway. She had a spare bedroom with a handmade quilt and a window that looked out onto a stand of river birches. She made me sit at her kitchen table and eat scrambled eggs while she watched me with the careful patience of someone who understood that some situations require silence before they require words. She didn't lecture me. She didn't offer opinions about my choices or my parents' choices. She just said, "You're going to be fine." And the way she said it made it feel less like a comfort and more like an instruction. She kept me. That is the simplest way to put it. When I started showing, she came with me to appointments. When I couldn't concentrate on my correspondence school coursework, because of the exhaustion that swallows you in the 8th month, she would sit across the table and read out loud from the textbooks until I found my way back into the material. When my daughter Noelle was born on a Thursday in February, Rosalind was the one holding my hand. She was the one who said, "There she is. There's the whole world." I finished my GED. I enrolled in community college. I worked nights at a call center and mornings at a dry cleaner and found the margins of each day where I could study. It took me 6 years to finish a bachelor's degree, 7 to finish law school. Rosalind watched Noelle during classes and clinic hours. She taught my daughter how to bake cornbread and identify birds by their calls and sit quietly with a book for an hour without fidgeting. She did all of this without once suggesting I owed her anything. When I passed the bar exam, she cried. It was the only time I ever saw her cry. The years between that exam and the morning Vera and Clyde walked into my courtroom were years of steadily becoming someone. Public defender. Assistant DA. Appointed to the bench at 41, the youngest in the district at the time. I had built a life so deliberately, one careful year after another, that the original wound, the driveway, the garbage bag, the dark drive to Rosalind's house, had receded to something I could examine without flinching. I thought I had made a kind of peace with it. Then Rosalind died. And 3 weeks later, her estate attorney called to walk me through a will I hadn't known existed. He was a gentle man, patient with my silences as he explained what Rosalind had left behind. She had, over decades, invested quietly. She had sold a parcel of farmland she'd inherited from her own mother, land she'd never mentioned to anyone, and placed the proceeds in accounts she tended like a garden. The total after investments, after interest, after years of compounding was $1.4 million. All of it, the attorney said, left to me. I sat in his office for a long time after that. I kept thinking about the call center shifts, the textbooks she read aloud, the cornbread. I kept thinking about how she lived, carefully, without luxury, and how she had been quietly building this the entire time. She knew I would try to make her spend it on herself, the attorney said. She wanted you to stand on your own first. Vera and Clyde found out within a week. I don't know how. Small cities have their own circulatory systems for information, and money moves through them like blood. The first contact was a voicemail. Clyde's voice, flatter than I remembered. We heard about Rosalind. We should talk. Then a letter, formal, almost legal, in its phrasing. We believe as family members we have a rightful claim to a portion of the estate. We expect to hear from you. I did not respond. A month later, they filed suit. The petition was 8 pages. It alleged that Rosalind had been unduly influenced, that her mental capacity was impaired, that I had manipulated an elderly woman into altering her estate plans to benefit myself. I read it standing at my kitchen counter at midnight, Noelle asleep down the hall, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, that cold, particular humiliation of being named as the problem in a story you lived through as the victim. I couldn't represent myself. I found a litigator I trusted, a woman named Celeste Armand, who reviewed the file in one sitting. They have nothing, she said. The will is iron. Every document is in order. Every signature witnessed. Every financial statement clean. What they have is audacity, she said, and audacity isn't evidence. She wasn't wrong. But I had stood in enough courtrooms to know that the absence of evidence doesn't stop people. Vera and Clyde were not deterred by facts. They were operating on something older and more durable, the absolute conviction that they were owed something, that I had taken a position in the world that rightly belonged to their version of things. The hearing drew more people than it should have. The case had accumulated a kind of local gravity. I walked up the courthouse steps in a charcoal suit, Celeste beside me, and felt the old instinct rise, the one that says make yourself smaller. I let it pass. I had spent 22 years unlearning that instinct. Vera and Clyde were near the entrance with their attorney. They smiled when they saw me. That was what I noticed first. Not anger, not discomfort, confidence. They had looked at this situation and concluded that they would win. I thought about Rosalind's kitchen. I went inside. The moment with Gerald Fitch, the good morning, the 4 words that drained them, lasted only a few seconds. Then the room settled, the bailiff called for order, and we began. Celeste was methodical and devastating. She laid out Rosalind's full medical history for the years in question, the evaluations, the clinical assessments, the documentation that showed a woman of clear and deliberate mind. She entered into evidence every document from Rosalind's estate planning process, organized chronologically, each page signed and witnessed with a precision that reflected exactly who Rosalind was. Then she turned to a different file. These records, she said, document that my client was removed from her parents' home at 17, pregnant, without financial resources or a plan for her care. I watched Vera straighten her spine in the gallery, the old reflexive dignity. What followed was a timeline of everything my parents had not done. No communication. No financial support. No acknowledgement that a grandchild existed. 22 years of silence entered into the record. When Clyde testified, he said, "We thought she needed to learn responsibility." Celeste paused. She didn't move. "And did she asked quietly. He had no answer that didn't condemn him. When Vera testified, she cried. Celeste let her finish before asking, "In 22 years, did you contact her once?" Vera looked at her hands. "No." The ruling came without drama. The judge, a colleague, not a close one, read it evenly. The evidence supports the full validity of the decedent's will. There is no basis for redistribution. The petition is denied. I sat very still. I had expected to feel something clean and certain. What I felt instead was closer to exhaustion, the kind that settles in after you've been braced for impact for so long that the absence of impact is its own shock. In the hallway afterward, they found me. Clyde looked older than I had allowed myself to notice during the proceedings. Vera's hands were unsteady. "We didn't know you'd become a judge," he said. I finished the sentence for him. "You didn't know anything about my life." "Whose choice was that?" Neither of them answered. Vera said, quietly, "We were ashamed of ourselves. We made it your burden instead." I had waited 22 years to hear something like that. It arrived, and it was smaller than I expected. Not because it was insincere, I believe, looking at her face in that hallway, that she meant it, but because some debts can be acknowledged without being resolved. I told them I needed to go. Noelle was waiting. That evening I drove to the cemetery. I placed flowers at Rosalind's grave and stood there for a while in the cooling air, the kind of silence that a cemetery earns. She had given me so much that I'm still discovering the edges of it. Not the money, though. The money changed things in real and practical ways. The house I finally bought, the scholarship fund I set up for young mothers finishing school. What she gave me that cannot be liquidated was the evidence that someone had seen me clearly and chosen to stay. I am not at peace with my parents. I am not at war with them, either. There was a single conversation in a diner 3 weeks after the verdict, a booth, terrible coffee. We talked for an hour. It didn't fix anything. I didn't need it to. What I needed was to stop carrying the story, as though the ending was still being written. It was written. I had written it. Have you ever considered what it costs to rebuild yourself entirely from material that was given to you by someone who wasn't even obligated to give it? Rosalind owed me nothing. She gave me everything anyway. I think about what it means that the people who were supposed to love me without condition required something from me before they could stay, and the person who had no obligation loved me without one. Some families are not the ones we're born into. Some families are the ones who answer the phone at 4 a.m. and say simply, "Come." Whatever family you have built, or are building, or are still looking for, I hope you find someone who answers. The first thing I noticed when I pulled into my parents' driveway that evening was the smell of fresh paint. Not the inside kind, the kind that signals nesting and renewal. The outside kind. The kind people use when they want a house to look like nothing is wrong. I had driven 4 hours from Cincinnati for Thanksgiving, which was already a compromise. The previous visit had ended with my mother telling my aunt, loudly enough to carry through the kitchen wall, that she sometimes wondered whether adopting would have been simpler. That was 8 months ago. I had not been back since. But I came anyway, because I was still operating under the assumption that presence was a form of healing. I should have read the paint more carefully. Dinner itself went the way dinners in that house had always gone. My father held court. My younger sister Bridget orbited him, laughing at the right moments, agreeing with precision. My Aunt Rosalind, who had never once in her life said a kind thing that wasn't also a trap, watched me the way she always did, like she was calculating something. I ate carefully, spoke carefully, took up careful space. And then my mother, who had been refilling wine glasses for 90 minutes, set down the bottle and said, without preamble, that she and my father had decided to convert my old bedroom into a home office, which meant the storage boxes in the closet needed to go. She had already started on them, she said. Most of it was clutter. I asked what she had kept. She looked at Rosalind. Rosalind looked at her coffee cup. I went upstairs. The closet was empty. 3 boxes of childhood records, school projects, the folder of letters my grandmother had written me during the years she lived in Portugal, the leather journal I had kept from age 12 to 15, all of it gone. Not relocated to another room. Not stacked in the garage. My mother, when I came back downstairs, said she had brought 2 bags to the donation center that afternoon. Then she shrugged in a way that suggested the subject was closed and asked Bridget to pass the sweet potatoes. Rosalind said, "You always did hold on to things too long, Mara." Bridget laughed. My father didn't look up from his plate. I did not raise my voice. I said goodnight, gathered my overnight bag from the guest room, and walked to my car in the dark. They probably assumed I was being dramatic, performing hurt to force an apology that would never come anyway. What they could not have known was that I had taken something with me before I left. Not dramatically, not consciously at first. I had slipped 3 items from my mother's desk into my bag while retrieving my jacket from the hallway closet, a manila folder, a USB drive, and a small black notebook with my father's initials embossed on the cover. They had been sitting on top of a stack of papers beside her keyboard, papers I had glanced at long enough to recognize what they were. I am a healthcare compliance auditor. I work primarily with nonprofit hospitals and their donor accounts. What I do professionally is trace money. I find where it went, confirm it went where it was supposed to, and document the difference when it didn't. I pulled onto the highway with the folder in my passenger seat and drove the first hour without music. My grandmother Eleanor had died 14 months earlier. She had not been wealthy by most measures, But she had been careful. The kind of careful that comes from surviving scarcity in childhood. When I was in my mid-20s, she had called me specifically, not my parents, not Bridget, to ask whether I could help her organize the charitable trust she wanted to establish in her final years. A modest endowment meant to fund literacy programming at 2 rural libraries she had loved. She chose me because I understood compliance structures. She had told me so directly in that way she had of saying plain-spoken things without embarrassment. I had helped her establish the account, set up the disbursement schedule, and agreed to serve as secondary oversight trustee, a role that required no action, unless the primary trustee, my father, failed to file the annual charitable distributions on time. He had not filed them. Not once since her death. The folder I had taken from my mother's desk contained 3 years of unfiled disbursement notices, 2 IRS inquiry letters, and a wire transfer summary showing that a portion of the trust's principal had been moved to a private account I did not recognize and had not authorized. The USB drive contained a financial planning document my father had prepared for the house sale he and my mother had been quietly arranging for the past 6 months. The notebook contained handwritten notes about the sale timeline and a line I read at a red light 40 miles outside the city that I will not quote verbatim, but which made clear that both my parents understood the trust funds were not theirs to use and had proceeded anyway. I want to be precise about what happened next, because this is where people tend to read the story wrong. I was not angry in the way people expect. I was not shaking, was not crying, was not rehearsing confrontations in the rearview mirror. I was very, very quiet. The specific kind of quiet that settles over a person when they finally understand the full shape of something they have been standing too close to see clearly. I spent the following week documenting everything. I pulled the trust account records through the compliance portal, where I had oversight access. I cross-referenced the wire transfer dates against my father's notebook entries. I consulted, carefully and hypothetically, with a colleague who specialized in fiduciary misconduct to understand what the exposure looked like. I built a folder so structured and sourced that it could have been handed to a regulator without a single revision. On Thursday, my phone rang. It was Bridget, which was unusual. She and I had never been close in the way people imagine sisters are close. We had shared a house and a last name, and that was mostly the extent of it. She worked in real estate and carried herself the way people do when they have decided that charm is a professional skill. "Mom says you left without saying goodbye," she said, as though that were the news. "Mom threw away Grandma Eleanor's letters," I said. A pause. She said they were taking up space. "What does Dad need the trust account for?" Another pause, longer. "What do you mean? There have been no charitable disbursements filed since Grandma died," I said. "I have the IRS correspondence. I also have the transfer records." "So what does he need it for?" She told me I was misreading things. I told her I was a compliance auditor and that misreading financial documentation was not, professionally speaking, something I did often. She told me I was always looking for reasons to make things difficult. I told her I was looking at wire transfer records from March, June, and September, totaling more than $40,000 moved to an account not named in the trust instrument. The line went quiet in a different way after that. "Meet me Saturday," she said finally. "Just coffee. Don't do anything before Saturday." We met at a place near her office. A cafe with too many exposed surfaces and too little noise insulation. She arrived looking composed in the way people look when composure is taking effort. She did not sit before she started. "Dad needs the house sale to clear," she said. "There's a buyer. It closes in 6 weeks. If the trust issue surfaces before then, the whole thing unravels." "The trust issue," I repeated. "Don't be precise at me right now, Bridget." "He moved donor money. Charitable donor money that Grandma Eleanor designated for library programs." She pressed both hands flat on the table. "He intended to replace it. That's what people say when they haven't replaced it." She rubbed the side of her face. "What do you want?" I had been asking myself that since Thursday night. I was not interested in theater. I was not interested in scenes. What I wanted was specific and I thought reasonable. The disbursements had to be filed, the missing funds restored to the trust before the house closed, and the two libraries had to receive what Eleanor had intended. Beyond that, I wanted my parents to stop constructing a narrative in which I was the unstable daughter. "Can you agree to those terms?" I asked. She looked at the table. "I can try." That's not the same thing. By Sunday, the family group text had become active in the way it only became active when someone was trying to shape a story before it could be told by someone else. My Aunt Rosalind posted something extended and fragrant about the sacrifices parents make, and the ingratitude of children who only see what they want to see. My mother added a response that described herself as heartbroken without specifying why, which was, Bridget had apparently shared enough to create alarm but not enough to create accountability. I understood what they were doing. I had grown up watching them do it. Monday evening, my father called. He spoke in his formal voice, the one he used when he wanted to sound like the reasonable party in a room. "You took documents from this house," he said. "I took documents that implicated fiduciary misconduct from a desk where they were sitting in plain view," I said. "You can argue about my methods with the IRS when they ask why neither of us has that problem with the documents themselves." Silence. "What do you want?" he asked. It was the same question Bridget had asked, in the same tone, which told me they had compared notes and arrived at the same strategy: treat this as a negotiation. "I want Eleanor's trust honored," I said. "I want the disbursements filed and the missing funds restored. I want no version of this story circulated in which I am the villain. And I want the letters Mom threw away acknowledged as what they were." He told me I was being unreasonable. I told him I had the USB drive, the notebook, and the wire transfer summary, and that I also had a professional obligation as a named trustee to report material irregularities to the State Attorney General's Charitable Trust Division, an obligation I had so far exercised discretion in not fulfilling. He told me I wouldn't do that to my own family. I told him I already had the form pulled up. He hung up. The calls began arriving at 11:40 that night. My father. My mother. Rosalind, which surprised me slightly. Bridget, who had apparently been crying for some time before she dialed. I did not answer any of them. I sat at my kitchen table with the documentation spread in careful stacks and listened to voicemails stack up like weather. At 1:17 in the morning, the pounding started. 4 of them, it turned out, my parents, Rosalind, and Bridget. I looked through the peephole before I said anything. My father had both palms against the doorframe. My mother's eye makeup had tracked down her face in 2 parallel lines. Rosalind was clutching her coat closed like the hallway was judging her. Bridget stood slightly apart from the group with both hands over her mouth. I opened the door on the chain. "We were wrong," my mother said immediately. Her voice cracked on the second word. "About the letters, about everything, Mara, please. You are standing outside my apartment at 1 in the morning, I said, because the house sale falls apart if I file the report. Because we are your family, my father said. So were the people Grandma Eleanor gave her money to honor. He looked like he wanted to say something that required a different version of this situation. "What do you need us to do?" Bridget asked. She was not performing. That was the difference. She had been crying, genuinely, and it had stripped the real estate voice entirely. I told them through the door gap. Every word of it, the same terms I had given my father on the phone, stated now in front of witnesses. The trust restored before closing. The disbursements filed by end of week. A written acknowledgement to the family, not private, not buried, that I had not sabotaged anything, that I had done what a trustee is legally required to do, and that the version of events Rosalind had been circulating was false. Rosalind started to object. I told her she could object or she could go home, but the terms did not change. My mother said, "If we do all of this, will you come back?" I looked at her through the 2-inch gap in the door for a long moment. "Come back to what?" I asked. "The version where I absorb everything and call it love?" She didn't answer. "The terms stand," I said. "The decision of what comes after that is separate." They stood in the hallway for another few minutes, rearranging themselves around a silence that didn't offer any cover. Then my father nodded. Once, the kind of nod that a man gives when he has run out of alternatives and is grading himself on accepting that gracefully. They left at 2:24 in the morning. I sat with the documentation until dawn, not reviewing it, just sitting with it, the way you sit with something after the hardest part is over. The disbursements were filed by Friday. The funds were restored from the house sale proceeds 2 weeks before closing. Bridget sent me a message that said only, "The libraries have been notified." I read it 3 times before I replied. The closing happened. My parents sold the house for less than they had hoped, after the buyer's attorney flagged the trust irregularities during due diligence and renegotiated accordingly. My father has not called since. My mother sent a card at Christmas with a note that was 3 sentences of careful edited language that told me she had rewritten it several times. Rosalind has not been in contact, which I understand is her version of acknowledgement. Bridget and I have spoken 4 times since that night. Carefully at first, then less carefully. Something is being built there, slowly, the way you build things after the original structure has been properly demolished. I kept 1 letter. A single page my grandmother had written me the December before she died, which I had fortunately scanned. I had it printed on good paper and framed it myself. It sits on my desk beside my monitor. Every morning I read the last line, which I won't reproduce here because it belongs to her, and to me, and then I open my work. There is a version of this story that ends with reconciliation, everyone around a table. The hard year softened by enough time and shared meals. I am not opposed to that version existing eventually. What I am opposed to is pretending it has arrived before it has. Some people understand your importance only after access to you becomes conditional. That is not a character flaw in you. It is information. So I want to ask you something honestly. If the people who claim to love you most had spent years treating your loyalty as infrastructure, something load-bearing and invisible and never acknowledged, would you have walked to that door? And what do you think it costs a person to finally stop answering it?